Welcome to Point by Point, conversations, interviews, and legal commentary for today's business professionals, brought to you by Waller. Today, Waller's Lance Williams talks with Eric Scalzo about the major concerns he's hearing from business owners and executives around the country.
Eric, thank you so much for joining us. I guess the first question right out of the gate is, what are some of the biggest questions you're hearing from clients and business owners you're talking to right now?
Yeah, Lance. So it's Friday, March 27th. If you'd asked that question a week ago, I would have said, what happens when one of my providers, one of my employees test positive for COVID-19, or what happens if a patient who we saw a couple days ago calls us and says that they've tested positive. I think we've worked through with most of our clients kind of the operational issues. The second wave of issues were then government orders rolling out through various states in terms of essential businesses, and am I an essential business? Do I have to remain open, or can I remain open? And now things are pivoting to the CARES Act, which was passed. And what are the benefits under the CARES Act, and how can I take advantage of some of the relief legislation and relief packages, stimulus packages that are in there, particularly around the SBA loans and applicability for employers who employ 500 or fewer employees, and how do you distinguish amongst, particularly in the healthcare space and in the MSO and DSO space, how do you distinguish between management company, non-clinical personnel, and the actual practices and clinical personnel, and what does that mean for the analysis in terms of, do I have more than or fewer than 500 individuals in my employ?
And it sounds like that's a big distinguishing factor. If you look at Families First and some of the things that it provides for employees, but then you also look at the CARES Act, there's a difference there. There's a bit of a dividing line in terms of the number of employees and which companies are covered by which act and which law. Can you help us kind of walk through kind of how companies are looking at that and trying to figure out, does this apply to me? Does this not? Help us kind of understand, who's covered where and what companies need to be looking at in terms of which part of the line they fall on.
Yeah. I don't think, as much as people joke about, the intelligence in Washington, I don't think that they mistakenly chose 500 as the number for both bills. The whole goal of the incentive packages, lumping them together, is to keep Americans employed, receiving paychecks, hopefully off unemployment, although if they are unemployed under the CARES Act, there is increased benefit at this point. But to allow them to continue to make their rent payments and their car payments, and so that the whole economic engine of the United States doesn't grind to a halt. And so our Family First Act, the idea was if you have fewer than 500 employees, you're mandated to provide a certain amount of paid leave. And then you turn around, and under the CARES Act, if you have fewer than 500 employees, you're allowed to access SBA loans that have, in my opinion, fairly favorable terms, right? 4%, and you can get up to a multiple on your average monthly expenses. Really, it's payroll, rent expenses, and interest and debt expenses that you've incurred over the past year. And so it allows you to kind of offset, right? On the one hand, they want you to keep folks employed, and they've got a burden tied to that in the form of the Family First Act. And then they turn around and allow you to get the benefit of the CARES Act if you meet certain criteria through the small business loan. And so I think the two interplay well together, and hopefully will achieve what Congress wanted them to. But the questions that we're getting now from folks are really around, as I said earlier, the question of who is the employer and how many employees report to that employer for affiliation purposes under the CARES Act, and can they qualify for the SBA loan?
So talk to us a little bit about the when you're talking with employers, what are some of the biggest challenges that they're thinking about maybe over the next 30 to 60 days? What are some of the challenges that they're really kind of wrestling with right now?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between liquidity and solvency, right? And I think a number of clients, there's not a going concern issue for them in terms of solvency and whether or not they have the ability to as a business remain in operation. They do have a potential liquidity problem here, though, especially the smaller practices or the group practices that really live off of 70 or 80% of their AR is collected within the first 30 days. Well, we're running up pretty close to or pretty quickly on a 30-day window, and after that, really no money is going to be coming in. And so it's how do the companies survive once their revenue dips down through no fault of really anybody, right? Through the government order or through the natural progression of people not going to see their providers or certain going to certain companies to spend their money. And so I think the CARES Act is going to provide, hopefully, kind of the blowout valve for the folks that are running up against that liquidity crunch in terms of how they can keep paying rent, keep paying the landlord, keep paying their employees and their employee benefits expenses, and really bridge over to what will hopefully be a quick turnaround and the V-shaped recovery that everybody is looking for. But will hopefully bridge them across these troubled times.
Gotcha. And you look at so many providers that currently aren't seeing a regular patient load or having folks come through the door. Are there concerns they have to have? So let's say that something is lifted in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. What are some concerns they need to think about in terms of getting back to normal or trying to get back to normal? What are some things that they need to be thinking about in terms of ramping back up?
It's not just are they going to be able to really unlock the door and let patients come in. In certain jurisdictions they're not allowed to now. Will they be able to in 2 weeks or 3 weeks? I don't know. But it's more about will the patients come at that point, right? If you are largely elective procedures, maybe more in the cosmetic world or the vanity world, are patients going to come to a medical setting and risk being exposed, whatever the risk is in your particular jurisdiction and geography, for that elective procedure? If something is borderline elective, are they, where are patients going to draw the line and actually come out of their homes? I do think that when the all clear sound, whatever that sounds like or looks like, is given, I think people want to get out and want to spend money and go back, restaurants and plays. But I just think if it's in the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a lot of hesitancy to get back in large groups or get back in public businesses where you're maybe sitting in a waiting room with other folks. And so I think thinking through the things that you can do to assure the patients that your waiting room, your exam rooms, are safe and sterile, and you've taken on additional procedures to help to continue to flatten the curve, right? It's not just going to get shut off. We're going to be dealing with this for some months in the future. And so I think assuring patients that you're addressing it appropriately is one thing that folks need to do.
So much has been happening in the last couple of weeks, and there have been so many questions related to operational things. How do you think businesses are going to be able to make this shift from being reactive to thinking proactively about the future? What does that process look like and feel like, and at what point do you think businesses will be able to start shifting their thinking again?
So I think I think if you had asked us 4 weeks ago if we were going to be living in the scenario that we're living in now, in terms of most folks working from home and there being government orders around the country to shut down non-essential services, I think a lot of folks would have said that's an overreaction, but it's now our reality. And so I think that for the past week plus, people have been backpedaling, right, and put on their heels a little bit in terms of reacting to this, reacting to the patient that calls them up to say, "Hey, I was in your office 3 days ago, and I was just diagnosed with COVID-19," or the provider or providers calling you, just as you're about to open the doors, saying, "Hey, I know I was in yesterday, and I know I interacted with all these people. I'm now showing symptoms," and reacting to what that means for the operations and for your obligations with regards to your patients and your other employees. So everyone has been very much necessarily reacting to the scenario. I think we're gonna see, and I have seen over the course of this week, the business leaders pivoting from that reaction, putting out the fires that they can, to how do we address this in a proactive way? How do we kind of circle up the troops and determine the best path forward? And I think the passage of the CARES Act in conjunction with the Family First Act is going to allow some certainty for the business folks over this weekend to sit down and crunch the numbers and figure out what it means in terms of whether or not they are going to lay people off next week, whether or not they're going to furlough folks, or whether or not they're going to try to, patch it together for the foreseeable future, given the opportunities under the CARES Act and the SBA loans and whatnot.
Shifting gears a little bit, let's talk a little bit about sort of the M&A landscape. And, obviously it's probably different now than what we were hearing 30 days ago. But what are you hearing right now, and what do you think that happens to the pipeline over the next 3 months, 6 months?
They're looking to run towards the fire and are looking for opportunities in this kind of downturn and time of uncertainty. And I think there's going to be a number of groups that maybe use this opportunity to throw up their hands and say, I do want to sell and get out. And so I think we're going to see certainly not the activity that we had for the beginning of Q1 here in 2020. We're not going to see that continue over the next couple of weeks and months, but I do think that we're going to see continued activity. We as a firm have been closing deals throughout all of this, and the number has gone down, and certainly the good number of the active deals have gone pencils down. But again, I think over the past 2 weeks, week and a half, 2 weeks, people have been reacting, and the immediate, and I think smart reaction in the face of all this uncertainty is to say, let's just go pencils down right now and kind of get a feel for where things are. And I think as we get a sense for the duration and real impact of this, we're going to see a number of those deals pick back up. We're going to see new LOIs get inked, and I think it is going to pick up. The fact of the matter is there is still a whole lot of cash sitting on the sidelines, and some of it has probably been deployed over the past couple of weeks in ways that 2 or 3 weeks ago nobody thought it would have been deployed. But there's still a lot of cash out there, and a lot of folks looking to make acquisitions. So I think as we get certainty and clarity into kind of the impact of this on the economy and the duration, I think we're going to see things pick up again.
And it sounds like you think that there may be some providers that this may give them an opportunity to take a second look and decide, is now, do we want to stick with it, or do we want to look at potentially looking for suitors? Is that something you think we'll see more of too?
Yeah, I do a lot of my work in the large dental group DSO space, and I think this is a perfect example of the benefits of affiliating with a large DSO who has the resources to work through. Family First Act and the CARES Act, they're not 5-page bills. They're massive bills with a lot of intricacies, and interpreting them and applying them and making sure you get the best benefits. That's not the job of the dentist with 5 or 10 or 15 offices who doesn't have the resources of some of these large groups, nor should it be. And so I think it just goes to prove out that as businesses become more involved in various healthcare specialties and healthcare arenas, that the providers will see that maybe that's a viable alternative to going it alone. And so I think that's right. And I also think it's an opportunity for those smaller groups to really entrench themselves and show their teams about their employment culture and why why they can or how they can help their employee family kind of get through this tough time too.
Thank you. Last question. You talk about folks sitting down this weekend, really kind of crunching the numbers. Do you have any thoughts on either a key question or a key thought that they need to keep in mind when they're going through that process? So we can any advice that should kind of be a leading thought as they're working through issues?
Yeah, we're putting together some materials on this now, but the particularly under the SBA loan, right? The concept of affiliation. Historically, certain groups have been excluded from SBA loans just because of their structure. But I think if you think through your structure and particularly around the MSO DSO space where you have these independent practices, think about whether or not the SBA loan is an opportunity for you or your affiliated practices. And I'm using the term affiliate there kind of in the traditional sense, not in the SBA sense. And so I think parsing that out, a lot of folks should think about that instead of taking the initial reaction of, SBA loans don't apply to private equity groups or private equity platform companies. There may be some ways to work it in. So I think being thoughtful about that is going to be really important going into kind of the next week and crunching the numbers to see what your path forward looks like.
Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time, and best of luck in the weeks ahead.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Point by Point, brought to you by Waller. Visit the News and Insights section of our website to listen to more episodes, subscribe to the podcast, find show notes, and more.